and have arrived at Gilkicker Fort, which guards the entrance to Portsmouth Harbour and still serves as a Navy observation point. From the beach here it seems no distance looking across Spithead to the eastern side of the Isle of Wight and the ports of Ryde and Fishbourne. A good trick for the young at heart is to clamber to the top of the earthen ramparts which enclose Gilkicker. Worth it though, because from the trig point on the top you get a very good view looking right across to Gosport and Portsmouth. Around the entrance to Portsmouth there are 20 forts on land and 4 at sea. One of them is no man's land fort. Lord Palmerston had them built, and there were so many of them that they became known as Palmerston's Follies. You soon know you're approaching Portsmouth and Gosport because the presence of the Navy begins to make itself felt. HMS Dolphin in Gosport is home for the submariners, and next door is the Royal Navy's bright and enterprising Submarine Museum. The man who runs the museum is a former submariner commander who lives and breathes submarines, and if infectious enthusiasm were enough, we'd all be driving one. He's Richard Compton Hall.
Right at the beginning of the century, when our submarines came into the service of King Edward VII, Fareham Creek, up harbour there, was the home of the quarantine ships and the powder hulks and the prison vessels. And so they stuffed submarines up there as well, because I expect you know that in those days submarines were called underwater, underhand and damned un-English vessels. And it wasn't until about 3 years later, in 1904, when submariners began to complain about being isolated up there with these unpleasant little ships that they were with, that they decided to give them a permanent home here. Now, Gosport was a very salubrious neighbourhood at that time, and it still is, of course. The doxies that swung their handbags in Squeeze Gut Alley, just up the way there, were a great deal superior to the ones that walked up and down Castle Street in Portsmouth and Southsea. So, not unnaturally, submariners chose this rather upmarket place to come, Fort Blockhouse, on this spit of land here, and we've been here ever since.
So really, submariners were looked down upon by the rest of the Royal Navy?
Well, yes, they were, because the officers striding these highly polished quarterdecks in their white gloves and swords and frock coats not only looked down on these little men scurrying around getting oily, at a time when engineers had only just been admitted to the wardrooms of the fleet. And of course they looked down upon them in actuality as well, these tiny little boats lying alongside. And submariners, let's face it, grew up with a bit of a chip on their shoulder.
Well, let's face it also, I mean, it is a fairly grubby trade, isn't it?
It's a little less so now. In fact, a modern nuclear submarine is more like a three-star hotel, and so is the food. But for a long time, you're quite right, it certainly was.
Nuclear submarines haven't made their way into the museum yet, but they do have a witness from a much earlier age.
I don't suppose you've heard of me. Sergeant Ezra Lee is the name of General George Washington's Revolutionary Army. I don't expect you know what I'm sitting in either. It doesn't look much like a submarine, do it? But that's what it is. The very first submarine to make an attack, way back in 1776.
From the world's first American submarine to Britain's first, built in 1901, sank in 1913, and raised from the seabed in 1982.
This is our real pride and joy. His Majesty's submarine torpedo boat number 1. Holland 1, usually called because that was the chap who invented her, a little Irish-American called John Philip Holland. Come inside and have a look.
Right.
After you, watch your head.
All right.
great job if you're a pygmy. Having said that, you know, it's extraordinary how much room there seems to be.
Ah, but we've got to make room yet for 2 torpedoes here, a whole lot of valves and wheels, 57 air bottles, 8 men, and 3 white mice.
3 mice?
Mice. We had to have mice because they told us when the carbon monoxide level was getting dangerous. And they kicked their little feet in the air and we came up.
Oh, so like miners with their birds and
That's
so
right,
on.
exactly the same, yes.
Actually, given the amount of time it was underneath the sea before it was hauled up, it's in rather good nick, isn't it?
She's fantastic, and nobody can understand it. Everything's in extraordinary good nick. In fact, I brought you here, Bob, to show you. That's a nut and bolt. It's got no grease on it at all. Just look. I mean, that shouldn't be possible, should it, really? And, you know, it's not just the nuts and bolts. Just have a look at the main engine and the main motor. Really, they might have been made very recently.
Now, I gather she never went to her prescribed depth, is that right?
No, thank heaven she didn't. The deepest recorded depth she went to was 58 feet. Now, in fact, she was designed to go down to 100 feet, but there's not room to go down to 100 feet in the Solent just off here, which is where she used to operate. And the deepest she ever went was 58 feet. Now, we just found out by very, very careful analysis done by the Director of Naval Construction that she would have collapsed at 60 feet. So, unknown to them, umpteen times they dived in the Solent here over a period of 12 years within just 2 feet of disaster.
So had she gone to 100, paper bag, just crumpled like
I'm
that?
afraid so.
Yes. Distinguished visitors?
Yes, very distinguished visitors. King Edward the Seventh, the then Prince of Wales, who was to become King George V, and Admiral Lord Jackie Fisher. And since we're talking about them, you might like to know that they all used that very beautiful loo there, a Dalton number 612 with a lovely mahogany Edwardian seat. I think really we should charge something very special for using that now.
Well, Richard, absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much for letting me visit.
It's a great pleasure, Bob. But now you've seen her, what do you think about what they used to say way back in King Edward's reign? No occupation for a gentleman's what they used to say. Do you agree with that?
Well, put it this way, possibly an occupation for a small gentleman.
Maybe.
Portsmouth may be the home of the Royal Navy, but for me, it's a place of endless ferries. Ferries, ferries, ferries. Ferries taking commuters to Ryde, cars and people to Fishbourne, and ferries going even further to St Malo, Cherbourg, Le Havre, and the Channel Islands. And one that doesn't go very far at all, the ferry from Gosport to Portsmouth, a distance of 1/3 of a mile. But it's the busiest service in Britain. A ferry leaves every quarter of an hour, 5:30 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. In your trip across, you begin to grasp quite how much Portsmouth has changed. An old naval salt simply wouldn't recognize the place. Gone are the great grey battleships which used to fill up the harbour. Because Portsmouth was never a commercial port, it was all navy. Now, with the rundown of the naval dockyards, a commercial role has been found for the city. It's one of these springboards for the continent, and the navy no longer dominates, but exists alongside the new commercial developments. In truth, you'll look quite hard to see a naval vessel. As everywhere on the south coast, the ubiquitous yacht. One man who's witnessed these fundamental changes is the manager of the Gosport ferry, Phil Robson.
With the gradual rundown of the naval dockyard here, passenger numbers have diminished, but even so, we're still carrying 3.5 million passengers a year. That's in both directions, of course, so it's still quite a sizable number of people.
Well, let's make a comparison with, say, 1970. How many were you carrying then and now?
You're talking about 10 million then and 3.5 now, so you can see what an effect the economic conditions have had on our ferry traffic, which is commuter-based, obviously.
Well, so we're talking quite dramatically of a decline in passengers carried, but, I mean, is there a future for you?
Oh, there'll always be a future for the ferry service here. There's no two ways about it. It's still the best way of getting between Gosport and Portsmouth.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?
Well, that's part of my job.
Arrival at Portsea. And by the way, if you catch the ferry on the Portsmouth side, there's no ticket office, and so you don't have to pay. Mind you, most people return the way they went, so they'll catch you on the Gosport side, where there is a ticket office, on your way back. They've been in this business for over 100 years, and they're not daft. Not far from where you embark is Nelson's flagship Victory. Extraordinary to think that this important part of our heritage and major tourist attraction was saved from rotting oblivion in 1928, not by a grateful nation, but by a group of maritime enthusiasts. Victory is technically a serving ship, and its commanding officer when I called was Captain Eddis.
She looks in a terrible state at the present moment. She was put into this dock in 1922, saved by the Society for Nautical Research, who started the Save the Victory appeal and raised initially £50,000 and persuaded the Navy to put her here. The Navy weren't interested in keeping a ship that was out of date and no longer could fight, and they were going to scrap her. But there was a tremendous public outcry about this, and they put her here. And she underwent 6 years restoration work under the patronage of King George V, and in 1928 she opened to the public. But she still continued to deteriorate, so that when they did a survey in the 1950s, they found she was in a really bad state. And they then started a restoration program, which is undergoing at the present moment and will do right on into the next century for another 20 or 30 years yet. When I arrived here, they had just finished 10 years' work on restoring the stern. Now they are concentrating on the bows. And just after I arrived, at the beginning of 1982, they took off the bowsprit, which reaches 110 feet from where it comes out of the ship, right out across the road over there. Yes. The bowsprit and then the jibboom and the sprit boom on the forward end of that.